A young woman went to bed in her college apartment believing the night was finally over. The lights were off, the noise outside had faded, and the long day of preparation for sorority recruitment was behind her. Within minutes, however, that quiet would be shattered by violence, fire, and unanswered questions that would ripple across an entire university and follow her family for the rest of their lives. By the time firefighters arrived, something was already terribly wrong. As flames tore through the lower level of the building, students gathered outside in disbelief. Police officers stood nearby, unaware that they had been inside the same house just minutes earlier. And somewhere amid the smoke, the truth was already beginning to burn away. This is the story of Andrea Delvesco. Andrea Delvesco was born on June 29, 1994 in Chicago, Illinois. She grew up in a close and supportive family, surrounded by parents who were deeply involved in her life, an older brother who looked out for her, and a younger sister she adored. From the outside, Andrea's childhood appeared almost idyllic. Her family was financially comfortable, and her father operated a successful investment firm that allowed them stability and opportunity. When Andrea was still young, her family relocated to Austin, Texas. It was there that she truly began to stand out. She enrolled in a well-regarded Christian school and quickly distinguished herself as both academically gifted and socially confident. Teachers described her as disciplined and curious. Classmates remembered her as warm, approachable, and driven. Andrea excelled in athletics, competing in both field hockey and lacrosse. She was equally committed in the classroom, earning recognition for her aptitude in languages. Spanish and Latin came naturally to her, and she developed a deep appreciation for different cultures. Friends would later recall that Andrea often spoke about traveling or even living abroad one day, imagining a future beyond the borders of the life she knew. By the time graduation approached, Andrea had become exactly the kind of student top universities look for. Her applications went out to several prestigious colleges across the country. When acceptance letters arrived, she faced a difficult decision. Ultimately, Andrea chose the University of California, Los Angeles. Her parents had hoped she would remain closer to home. Her older brother was attending a university in Chicago, and they liked the idea of having at least one sibling nearby to keep an eye on her. Still, they believed in Andrea's independence and ambition, and they supported her decision to move across the country. Andrea arrived at UCLA eager and optimistic. From her first week on campus, she immersed herself in university life. She joined a sorority almost immediately, forming close friendships that would define her college experience. She moved into the dorms with other members and quickly became known as someone reliable, friendly, and deeply committed to her responsibilities. Andrea worked hard academically, pursuing degrees in psychology and Spanish. Despite coming from a family that could easily support her, she insisted on working part-time jobs whenever possible. To her, earning her own money wasn't about necessity, it was about pride and independence. As the years passed, Andrea thrived. She balanced her coursework, her job, her sorority commitments, and her social life with remarkable ease. She rarely complained, even when she was overwhelmed. Those closest to her later said Andrea had an almost calming presence, someone who made stressful situations feel manageable simply by being there. By the fall of 2015, Andrea was 21 years old and entering her senior year at UCLA. With senior status came new opportunities. Sorority members in their final years were allowed to rent apartment-style housing just off campus, a major milestone for many students. These residences offered more independence, more privacy, and a sense of adulthood beyond dorm life. And Andrea and several of her sorority sisters eagerly signed a lease for one of these apartments, located only a short walk from the university. The building housed multiple students, most of whom were involved in Greek life. It was lively, social, and rarely quiet. Around the same time, Andrea adopted a small chihuahua from a local animal shelter. She instantly bonded with the dog and began volunteering at the shelter regularly. Friends said the dog became her constant companion, often curled up beside her while she studied or relaxed after long days. September was an especially busy time. Sorority recruitment season had arrived, one of the most important periods of the year for Greek organizations. Andrea and her friends spent countless hours preparing displays, painting signs, organizing materials, and rehearsing introductions for incoming freshmen. On the night of September 20th, the work stretched late into the night. Laughter echoed through the apartment as the women worked together, fueled by excitement and exhaustion. One by one, they drifted off to their rooms, leaving the apartment quieter as the early morning hours approached. Andrea remained awake longer than most. She sat in the living room with a friend, talking about classes, plans after graduation, and the busy week ahead. At around 3:30 in the morning, Andrea dozed off on the couch. Sometime later, she woke up, gathered her things, and went to her bedroom to sleep. What happened next would become the center of an investigation that stunned investigators and shattered her family. A few hours later, one of Andrea's roommates, who lived upstairs, was suddenly awakened by a sound that instantly triggered fear. She heard a woman screaming. At the same time, a dog was barking frantically. The noises were unmistakable and seemed to be coming from downstairs, from Andrea's room. Panicked, the roommate tried calling Andrea. There was no answer. Unsure of what to do but deeply concerned, she contacted the police. Officers arrived quickly and entered the apartment. By that time, everything had gone silent. No screaming, no barking, no visible signs of a struggle. They walked through the common areas but did not enter each bedroom. Most of the residents were asleep, and there were no signs of forced entry or immediate danger. Believing the disturbance may have been a nightmare or misunderstanding, the officers left. Only minutes passed. Then came a loud crash. The roommate rushed to her balcony and looked down. Smoke was pouring from Andrea's bedroom. Flames followed almost instantly, spreading with terrifying speed. As she stared in disbelief, she saw a man emerging from Andrea's room, wrapped in a blanket, running away from the building. The fire alarms blared. Students poured outside, panicked and confused. Some of Andrea's friends ran back toward her room, desperate to reach her. The door was locked, an unusual detail, as the girls rarely locked their doors. Using a spare key, they forced the door open. Thick smoke and flames rushed out. Through the haze, they could barely see a body lying motionless on the bed. They screamed Andrea's name. There was no response. Overcome by heat and smoke, they were forced to retreat. Firefighters arrived soon after, but the fire had already taken hold. It would take more than 30 firefighters over 15 minutes to bring it under control. When they finally entered Andrea's room, they found a body burned beyond recognition. And that was when police realized this was no accident. As the flames were finally extinguished and firefighters began ventilating the building, the atmosphere outside the apartment complex grew heavy with dread. Students stood wrapped in blankets, some crying openly, others staring silently at the charred structure. Word spread quickly that one person had not made it out. Andrea Delvesco was missing. When firefighters were able to safely enter the lower unit, they discovered a body lying on the bed inside the most severely damaged room. The fire had burned so intensely that visual identification was impossible. The remains were carefully removed and transported to the medical examiner's office, while police secured the scene and began treating the apartment as a potential crime scene. Almost immediately, firefighters reported something that did not sit right with them. Experienced crews are trained to recognize the patterns of accidental fires: faulty wiring, overloaded outlets, candles left unattended. None of those signs were present in Andrea's room. Instead, investigators noticed a trash can sitting directly on the bed, right next to the body. That detail alone raised serious concern. Closer examination revealed that the fire had originated in or near the trash can. Someone had placed it on the bed and intentionally ignited it. This was not an accident. This was deliberate. Police detectives were notified, and within hours, the case shifted from a fire investigation to a suspected homicide. As forensic teams worked through the ruins of the apartment, more disturbing evidence emerged. Beneath the soot and ash, investigators found large bloodstains on the bed and floor. In an accidental fire, blood would have no reason to be present. This discovery confirmed what firefighters already feared. Andrea had been attacked before the fire was set. Meanwhile, students were being interviewed one by one. Most were still in shock, struggling to process what had happened just hours earlier. Many assumed Andrea had died in a tragic accident. Even her family, who were contacted that morning, believed the same. Andrea's parents immediately flew to Los Angeles. They arrived devastated but clinging to the belief that the fire had been accidental. It would be days before they learned the full truth. At the medical examiner's office, specialists worked to confirm the victim's identity. The fire had destroyed Andrea's fingerprints, leaving investigators with few options. Ultimately, dental records were used to make a positive identification. The body was Andrea Delvesco. What the autopsy revealed would change everything. Andrea had suffered 19 stab wounds. The injuries were severe and unmistakable. Any remaining doubt vanished in that moment. This was a brutal killing. Even more chilling was another finding. There was no soot or smoke in Andrea's lungs. That meant she had already died before the fire was started. The flames were not the cause of death. They were an attempt to conceal it. Detectives also examined the possibility of a sexual assault. Due to the extensive fire damage, they could not definitively confirm or rule it out. What they could say with certainty was that no usable DNA from an attacker had been recovered from Andrea's body. By this point, the case had become one of the most serious investigations on and around the UCLA campus in years. Police began conducting formal interviews with every resident of the sorority apartment complex. They focused heavily on the upstairs roommate, the one who had first heard the screams and called the police. She described the night in detail. Earlier that morning, around 5:30, she had driven her boyfriend to the airport and returned home alone. As she entered the courtyard and climbed the stairs toward her apartment, she noticed a man standing at the bottom of the staircase. The area was dimly lit, but she could see him clearly enough to know he did not belong there. When the man realized she had noticed him, he ran. Startled and uneasy, she went inside and locked her door. She considered calling the police, but talked herself out of it. The neighborhood was full of students. He could have been visiting someone else. She didn't want to overreact. She called her boyfriend instead and told him what had happened. He reassured her, and eventually she went to sleep. Less than an hour later, she was awakened by the screaming. After police arrived and left, she heard more noise downstairs. This time she stepped onto her balcony. That was when she saw a man climbing out of Andrea's window, wrapped in a red blanket. She shouted at him, but he ran. She rushed outside, hoping to see where he went, but he had already disappeared. The only thing she noticed was a red car driving away. On the rear windshield were 3 large letters, Greek letters she immediately recognized as belonging to a fraternity called Lambda Alpha. This detail gave detectives their first concrete lead. Investigators knew the area was packed with fraternity and sorority members, and fraternity decals on cars were common. Still, they could not ignore the tip. They began questioning members of Lambda Alpha, asking if anyone owned a red Nissan matching the description. No one came forward. No one admitted to owning such a vehicle. At the same time, detectives expanded their search to nearby residences. That was when they learned about another incident that occurred the same night. Just across the street from Andrea's apartment, a group of students reported their place had been burglarized. Several items were missing, including a laptop and a Bluetooth speaker. This caught investigators' attention immediately. The stolen electronics suggested someone had been moving through the area that night, possibly entering multiple residences. More importantly, the Bluetooth speaker offered a potential digital trail. Detectives obtained the serial number and contacted the manufacturer. They requested immediate notification if anyone attempted to register or activate the device. Then they waited. While investigators followed leads, Andrea's family was facing their own nightmare. At first, they were told only that a fire had taken their daughter's life. Her parents struggled to accept it. Andrea was careful, responsible, and safety conscious. An accident did not make sense. When they learned the truth, that Andrea had been murdered, the devastation deepened. Andrea's mother insisted on seeing her daughter, needing undeniable proof that it was real. At the same time, veterinarians were working desperately to save Andrea's Chihuahua, which had been rescued from the burning room. Despite their efforts, the dog did not survive. Andrea's parents went to the clinic to say goodbye. Later, they would say that knowing the dog was no longer suffering brought them a small measure of comfort, believing it was now reunited with Andrea. Back in the investigation, days passed with little progress. The lead involving the red Nissan stalled. Interviews produced no confessions, no clear suspects. Then the call came. The stolen Bluetooth speaker had been activated. The IP address led detectives to Fresno, California, roughly 3 hours from UCLA. The registration traced back to a man named Joseph. Police immediately traveled to Fresno. When questioned, Joseph admitted he had registered the speaker online, but insisted it was not his. He said it belonged to his roommate, a man named Alberto. According to Joseph, Alberto had recently returned from Los Angeles and brought the speaker with him. This was the break investigators had been waiting for. Detectives focused their attention on Alberto immediately. According to Joseph, Alberto had traveled to Los Angeles a few days earlier, supposedly to attend a concert. He returned on September 22nd, just one day after Andrea Delvesco was killed. When he came back, Joseph noticed something strange. Alberto was not empty-handed. He had brought with him the Bluetooth speaker, along with a laptop, dishes, towels, and several bottles of alcohol. Joseph asked where the items came from. Alberto told him they were given to him by a friend in Los Angeles who was moving and did not want to take everything along. At the time, Joseph accepted the explanation. It did not strike him as especially suspicious. But now, in light of the investigation, it raised serious red flags. Detectives learned that Alberto was 22 years old and a student at Fresno State University. He had no prior criminal record. On paper, there was nothing that immediately marked him as dangerous. Still, the timing of his trip, the stolen items, and the activated speaker made him impossible to ignore. Finding Alberto was not easy. He was not staying at his registered address. And it took several days of tracking leads before officers located the house where he was currently staying. On September 26th, police surrounded the residence and took Alberto into custody without incident. At the police station, Alberto appeared calm. He agreed to speak with detectives and initially denied any involvement in wrongdoing. He said he had traveled to Los Angeles to visit a friend who lived near UCLA. According to his account, they attended a concert together and spent the next few days moving between parties before he returned home. When detectives asked about the Bluetooth speaker, Alberto claimed he had no idea what they were referring to. Investigators then confronted him with evidence that the speaker had been registered using his roommate's internet connection. Faced with that fact, Alberto changed his story. Now he said the speaker belonged to his friend from Los Angeles, the same friend who had given him a ride back to Fresno. That explanation quickly fell apart. Joseph told detectives that Alberto had returned alone. He watched him unload the items from the car and carry them into the garage himself. There was no friend, no ride. Confronted again, Alberto shifted his story a third time. This time, he admitted that he had stolen the items. He claimed that earlier that night, he and a friend had been at a student party where people were rude and disrespectful. Feeling drunk and angry, he decided to teach them a lesson by stealing whatever he could. Electronics, personal items, anything within reach. He insisted he was heavily intoxicated and barely remembered what he was doing. Then, almost as an afterthought, Alberto added something new. He claimed that around 5:30 in the morning, after leaving the party, he and his friend were confronted by a man hiding behind a dumpster. According to Alberto, the man pulled out a gun and demanded their belongings. Instead of complying, they ran, and the stranger fired a shot in their direction. Detectives listened carefully. When they asked Alberto to describe this supposed gunman, his description was detailed and disturbing. The clothing, the build, the general appearance matched what Andrea's neighbor had described earlier that same morning. Still, detectives were skeptical. No one in the area had reported hearing gunshots. There were no shell casings, no evidence of such an encounter. The story felt manufactured, another attempt to confuse the timeline and shift suspicion. Investigators pressed Alberto harder. They asked him directly if he had entered any women's residences while in Los Angeles. He denied it. He said he had met 2 female students through mutual friends, but insisted nothing inappropriate happened. The questioning continued for hours. Detectives made it clear they did not believe him. Finally, under mounting pressure, Alberto's story began to unravel completely. He changed his account again. This time he claimed that during the party where he stole the items, his friend, now identified as Eric, had met a woman who lived just across the street. Alberto said he did not know her name, but when he described her appearance, investigators immediately recognized the description. It matched Andrea Delvesco. As Alberto continued talking, he revealed details he should not have known. He described what Andrea had been wearing that night, including intimate details. Then, without realizing it, he said her name. The room went silent. Detectives knew they were dealing with a man who was lying, but also one who was dangerously close to revealing the truth. They pressed him further. After a long pause, Alberto lowered his head into his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "All right," he said. "It was Eric." According to this new version of events, Eric had gone with Andrea after the party. Minutes later, Eric supposedly came running back, visibly shaken. He told Alberto they needed to leave immediately because he had done something serious. Alberto claimed Eric admitted to attacking Andrea. He also said Eric had been wearing rubber gloves, which he threw away as they fled. Alberto went on to say that later, when he saw news reports about Andrea's death, he confronted Eric. According to Alberto, Eric confessed to killing her. Detectives were not convinced. Alberto's story had changed too many times. Each new version contradicted the last. But they could not ignore the accusation either. They needed to hear from Eric himself. When asked where Eric lived, Alberto provided an address, an apartment complex located just 5 minutes from Andrea's residence. Police wasted no time. Officers went to Eric's apartment and knocked on the door. Eric agreed to speak with them. He admitted that he and Alberto had been at a party that night, but insisted nothing unusual had happened. He said they returned to his apartment around 3 in the morning and that he slept until nearly 8. Eric claimed he was extremely drunk and had little memory of the night. When detectives confronted him with Alberto's accusations, Eric denied them outright. At that moment, investigators noticed something critical. Eric's apartment complex was equipped with surveillance cameras. Detectives immediately requested the footage. What they saw would dismantle both men's stories and bring the investigation into sharp focus. When detectives reviewed the surveillance footage from Eric's apartment complex, the case took a decisive turn. The cameras captured clear images from the night and early morning hours surrounding Andrea Delvesco's murder, and almost immediately, investigators realized that neither Alberto nor Eric had been truthful. The footage showed both men entering the apartment complex at approximately 2:40 in the morning. They appeared relaxed, not rushed, not panicked. But one detail stood out instantly. Alberto was wearing a black baseball cap, a dark t-shirt, and jeans. The exact clothing description Andrea's upstairs neighbor had given when she described the suspicious man she encountered near the staircase earlier that morning. It was not Eric. It was Alberto. That single realization reshaped the entire investigation. The cameras continued to track the two men. At around 4:30 in the morning, they were seen leaving the apartment again. Instead of heading straight to a car or exiting the property, they lingered outside, drinking and talking. Their behavior suggested leisure, not fear or urgency. Eventually, they walked out of the camera's view. Then, at 7:11 that same morning, the cameras captured them returning. This time, Alberto was wrapped in a red blanket. Detectives froze the frame. There was no doubt. It was the same red blanket Andrea's roommate had seen draped around the man who fled from her balcony moments before smoke began pouring from Andrea's room. The implications were chilling. The footage established that Alberto had been out during the critical window when Andrea was attacked and the fire was set. It also placed him back at Eric's apartment after the crime, carrying a blanket taken from the scene. Investigators now believed Alberto had acted alone, or at least had been the primary actor, while Eric's role, if any, remained unclear. Police brought Eric back in for another interview. This time, they showed him the surveillance footage. They pressed him to explain why Alberto had left the apartment during the early morning hours and why he returned with a blanket later that morning. Eric's response was inconsistent and vague. He claimed he was so intoxicated that night he barely remembered leaving the apartment at all. He insisted he did not know where Alberto had gone or what he had done. Despite Eric's continued denials, detectives had enough evidence to take both men into custody. Once Alberto was booked into jail, officers noticed something alarming. His hands were covered in scratches. The marks were fresh and visible, consistent with defensive wounds someone might receive while being fought off. When asked about them, Alberto brushed the question aside. He claimed he had gotten into a fight at a party, but could not remember who it was with or how it happened. Investigators were not convinced. While Alberto remained in custody, forensic teams executed search warrants on Eric's apartment. Inside, they found stains that appeared to have been scrubbed from the floors and surfaces. Samples were collected and sent to the lab for testing. Next, detectives located Alberto's vehicle. It was a red Nissan. On the rear windshield were fraternity letters belonging to Lambachi Alpha. The mystery surrounding the car was finally solved. Investigators learned that Alberto had once been a member of Lambachi Alpha, not at UCLA, but at a Fresno chapter. He had been removed from the fraternity for misconduct. The letters on the car were a remnant of a past affiliation, not an indication of a UCLA connection. With growing confidence, police searched Alberto's residence. What they discovered erased any remaining doubt. Inside a trash bag, investigators found the red blanket seen on surveillance footage and by witnesses at the crime scene. They also recovered a knife stained with blood, along with clothing Alberto had worn that night, including underwear. Even more disturbing, the bag contained a pair of women's underwear. Every item was carefully collected and sent to the lab. Then another witness stepped forward. One of Alberto's neighbors told detectives that after Alberto returned from Los Angeles, he had spoken openly about a murder near a college campus. What stood out was not just that Alberto mentioned the crime, but how much he seemed to know. According to the neighbor, Alberto described the victim being attacked, stabbed, and then having the residence set on fire to cover it up. These details had not been released publicly. Alberto allegedly boasted that the police would never catch the person responsible because the crime had been carried out too cleanly. Investigators disagreed. Forensic results soon began to come in. Blood samples taken from Alberto's vehicle matched Andrea Delvesco. The knife recovered from his home was also covered in her blood. So were his clothes. The evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors moved forward, charging both Alberto and Eric with murder. Although investigators increasingly believed Eric may not have known what Alberto intended to do, the evidence showed he had been present and connected to events that night. Then, just as the case seemed nearly complete, yet another witness came forward, one who would provide a crucial missing piece. The man told police that around 5:30 that morning, he had been outside near Andrea's apartment collecting plastic bottles. While he was there, a man approached him and asked if he knew how to fight. The witness said no. The man walked away, heading directly toward Andrea's building. The witness also noticed a red Nissan parked nearby with another person sitting inside. When detectives showed him photographs, the witness immediately identified the man who had approached him. It was Alberto. This testimony confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. Alberto had approached Andrea's apartment alone, while Eric remained in the car. This significantly weakened the case against Eric as a direct participant in the murder. As a result, prosecutors reconsidered Eric's charges. Eventually, Eric's charge was reduced to aiding and abetting, along with burglary related to the other break-in that same night. In 2017, Eric accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months in prison. Alberto, however, would face a jury, and the evidence against him was about to be laid bare in a courtroom. In the months and years following the verdict, the focus slowly shifted away from the courtroom and back toward the unanswered questions that lingered in the aftermath of Andrea Delvesco's death. For investigators, the case was closed. For the university, life gradually returned to normal. But for Andrea's family, there was no sense of resolution, only a quiet, enduring ache. Andrea's parents began speaking publicly, not out of anger, but out of a need to understand what had happened in those final moments. They replayed the timeline repeatedly, searching for clarity. The most painful part was not the brutality of the crime itself, but the narrow window of time when intervention might have made a difference. Police officers had been inside the apartment. They had walked through the common areas only minutes after Andrea's roommate heard screams and barking. According to the timeline established during the trial, Alberto was likely still inside Andrea's room at that exact moment. Whether Andrea was already deceased or still alive remains unknown. Investigators could not say for certain. Officers involved in the initial response later explained their actions. They stated that when they arrived, the house was silent. There were no sounds of distress, no visible signs of forced entry, no evidence that a crime was actively occurring. Without probable cause, they said, they could not legally enter private bedrooms or conduct a more invasive search. From a procedural standpoint, they followed protocol. From a parent's perspective, protocol felt like a hollow explanation. Andrea's mother openly questioned how screams could be dismissed as a bad dream. She struggled to understand how police could leave without checking the one room where the noise had originated. Her frustration was not rooted in blame, but in grief, the kind that searches endlessly for meaning. The department conducted an internal review. No disciplinary action was taken. Officials concluded that the officers had acted appropriately based on the information available at the time. Still, the question remained. If officers had opened Andrea's door, would they have interrupted the attack? Would Alberto have fled? Would Andrea have survived? There are no answers. What is known is that Andrea was alone when she needed help most. In the wake of the tragedy, UCLA administrators faced intense scrutiny. Students demanded increased security, better lighting, and more proactive campus policing. The university responded by expanding patrols near off-campus housing, improving emergency response procedures, and increasing awareness programs focused on personal safety. Sororities and fraternities also reevaluated their housing policies. Doors that were once left unlocked were now secured. Balcony access points were reinforced. What had once felt like a safe, familiar environment was now viewed through a lens of vulnerability. Andrea's sorority sisters carried the trauma with them long after graduation. Some spoke openly about guilt, wondering if they could have done something differently, if staying up later or checking on Andrea might have changed the outcome. Counselors reminded them of a painful truth. They were not responsible. The responsibility lay solely with the person who chose to commit the crime. Andrea's friends worked to preserve her memory. They organized vigils, shared stories, and supported causes Andrea cared about, including animal rescue and language education. For many, honoring her life became a way to process the loss. Her parents established scholarships in her name, ensuring that Andrea's passion for learning and service would continue to impact others. They also became advocates for improved emergency response training, particularly in situations involving ambiguous distress calls. Alberto, meanwhile, was transferred to a state prison where he began serving his life sentence without the possibility of parole. He did not appeal the conviction. He did not issue a statement. According to prison records, he kept largely to himself. Those who had known him before struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the evidence presented at trial. Former classmates described him as quiet, sometimes socially awkward, but never violent. Yet the forensic record told a very different story. Eric completed his reduced sentence and was released. He did not speak publicly about the case. Investigators believe that while he may not have known Alberto's intentions, he had made a series of decisions that placed him at the edge of a tragedy he failed to stop. Andrea's case became a point of reference in criminal justice discussions about opportunity crimes, offenses that occur not because of long-term planning, but because of access, vulnerability, and impulse. Prosecutors argued that Alberto did not choose Andrea specifically. He chose an unlocked balcony, a quiet early morning, and a moment when no one was watching. That reality made the crime even more unsettling. It meant that Andrea was not targeted for who she was, but because she was there. For Andrea's family, that knowledge was difficult to accept. They preferred to remember her for who she'd been: intelligent, compassionate, ambitious, and deeply loved, not as a victim of circumstance. Years later, the apartment complex where Andrea lived looks no different than it did before. New students move in each year, unaware of the history written into those walls. Life continues as it always does, but for those who remember, the story has never truly ended. It lives on in quiet questions, in campus safety discussions, and in the hearts of a family forever changed. And it serves as a reminder that sometimes the most devastating moments unfold not in isolation, but just out of sight, while help is closer than anyone realizes. As time passed, Andrea Delvesco's case settled into the public record as a solved crime, but its emotional weight never faded for those who had been closest to her. For many students who were at UCLA during that time, the memory of that morning remained vivid. The smell of smoke in the air, the sound of sirens cutting through the quiet, and the sudden realization that something unimaginable had happened just steps away from where they slept. Andrea's parents returned home carrying a grief that words could not fully capture. Friends and relatives tried to comfort them, but there was no easy way forward. They described the loss as disorienting, as if the future they had envisioned for their daughter had been erased overnight. Holidays felt different. Birthdays passed in silence. Every milestone Andrea would never reach became a reminder of what had been taken. Yet even in their grief, Andrea's family refused to let her story fade into obscurity. They spoke about Andrea whenever they could. about her love of languages, her dedication to her studies, her kindness toward animals, and her habit of always checking in on the people around her. To them, Andrea was not defined by the way she died, but by the way she lived. Over time, they began working with victim advocacy groups and universities, sharing Andrea's story as a way to promote awareness and prevention. They emphasized the importance of taking distress calls seriously, even when the situation seems unclear. They spoke about the need for better communication between students and law enforcement, and the critical role that timely intervention can play. Andrea's case was often cited in training sessions for campus safety officers and emergency responders. It became an example of how quickly a situation can escalate and how silence does not always mean safety. In some departments, policies were quietly reevaluated. Officers were encouraged to err on the side of caution when responding to reports involving screams or repeated distress signals. Though no policy change could bring Andrea back, her family found some comfort in knowing that her story might help prevent another tragedy. Among Andrea's friends, the impact was deeply personal. Many described lingering anxiety in the months that followed. Simple sounds, a door closing, footsteps on stairs, voices in the distance, could trigger fear. Some struggled to sleep. Others avoided living in off-campus housing altogether. Counseling services saw an increase in students seeking help, not just from Andrea's sorority, but across the campus. The sense of invincibility that often accompanies youth had been shattered. For those who had lived in the apartment complex, the memories were especially heavy. The space that had once felt like home became a place of sorrow. Eventually they moved on, but the experience left a permanent mark on how they viewed safety and trust. Andrea's sorority sisters honored her in quiet, meaningful ways. They established an annual remembrance during recruitment season, ensuring that new members would know her name and understand the responsibility of looking out for one another. They spoke openly about the importance of community and awareness, reinforcing that sisterhood was not just a title, but a commitment. The case also sparked broader conversations about crime in student neighborhoods. Many people were surprised to learn how vulnerable off-campus housing could be, especially in areas filled with young residents who often left doors and windows unlocked. Law enforcement officials acknowledged that these neighborhoods were frequently targeted by individuals looking for easy access. Andrea's death became a sobering reminder that opportunity crimes can happen anywhere, even in places that feel familiar and safe. Meanwhile, Alberto began his life behind bars. Prison records indicated that he adapted quietly to incarceration. He did not seek the spotlight or attempt to justify his actions publicly. Those who encountered him described him as withdrawn. He rarely spoke about the crime and offered no explanation for his behavior that night. For investigators, Alberto's silence was not surprising. They believed the evidence spoke for itself. There was no mystery left to solve, no unanswered question about who was responsible. But motive remained elusive. Why Andrea? Why that night? The most unsettling conclusion was that there may have been no personal motive at all. Prosecutors believed the crime unfolded as a result of access and impulse, a decision made in seconds that ended a life forever. That randomness made the tragedy even harder to process. Andrea had not known Alberto. She had done nothing to invite harm. She had simply gone to bed in her own home. As the years passed, new students arrived at UCLA, unaware of the story unless someone told them. The campus continued to grow and change, but Andrea's case remained part of its history, a quiet cautionary tale embedded in the lives of those who remembered. For Andrea's parents, remembrance became both a burden and a necessity. They visited places Andrea loved, reread old letters, and held on to memories that felt painfully close yet impossibly distant. They spoke often about forgiveness, not as something owed to Alberto, but as something they pursued for their own peace. They acknowledged that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, nor did it mean excusing what had been done. It meant choosing each day to live without being consumed by anger. Andrea's life, though tragically short, left an enduring legacy. Her story continues to be told not as a spectacle, but as a warning and a call to awareness. A reminder that safety should never be assumed. A reminder that every distress call matters. And a reminder that behind every true crime story is a life that once held infinite possibility. As the years move forward, Andrea Delvesco's case quietly took on a broader meaning beyond the courtroom and the campus where it unfolded. What had once been a shocking local tragedy became a reference point in conversations about student safety, emergency response, and the thin line between normalcy and disaster. For many parents sending their children off to college, Andrea's story struck a deep nerve. It challenged the comforting belief that campuses and surrounding student housing were insulated from serious crime. Andrea had done everything right. She was responsible, well-liked, and living among friends in an area filled with other students. Yet none of that protected her. Universities across the country began reevaluating how they address safety and off-campus housing. While these areas technically fell outside university jurisdiction, schools recognized that students still expected guidance and protection. Some institutions expanded safety escort programs, others invested in better lighting and surveillance, and many increased collaboration with local police departments. Andrea's case was frequently cited in discussions about ambiguous emergency calls. Law enforcement trainers used it as an example of how quickly a situation can change, and how silence after a disturbance does not always mean the danger has passed. In some departments, officers were encouraged to treat reports of screams or repeated distress sounds with heightened caution, even when no immediate evidence was visible. Though these changes could not undo what happened, they represented small steps toward preventing similar tragedies. Andrea's parents continued to honor her in ways that reflected who she had been. They spoke about her love for animals, her dedication to education, and her dreams of living abroad. They wanted people to understand that Andrea's life was not defined by her death, but by her curiosity, kindness, and ambition. They also maintained contact with Andrea's friends and sorority sisters, many of whom remained deeply affected long after graduation. Some said Andrea's story influenced their career paths, inspiring them to work in counseling, social services, or criminal justice. Others said it changed how they approached everyday decisions, from locking doors to checking in on friends. In quiet ways, Andrea continued to shape lives. On anniversaries of her death, those who knew her gathered privately. There were no grand ceremonies, just shared memories and moments of reflection. They spoke about her laugh, her determination, and the small details that still felt vivid years later. Meanwhile, Alberto remained incarcerated, his name fading from public discussion. For Andrea's family, that anonymity was welcome. They did not want him remembered. They wanted Andrea remembered. From a forensic perspective, the case became an example of how multiple small pieces of evidence, none of them definitive on their own, can combine to form an undeniable truth. A Bluetooth speaker activation, a surveillance camera, a witness noticing a blanket, a neighbor overhearing a boast. Each detail mattered. Investigators later acknowledged that without the stolen speaker, the case might have taken much longer to solve. It was a reminder of how technology, often overlooked, can play a critical role in modern investigations. At the same time, the case underscored the importance of human observation. Andrea's neighbor trusted her instincts. A man collecting bottles noticed something unusual. A roommate acted on concern, even if the outcome was not what anyone hoped. These moments taken together revealed how close the truth often is and how fragile the margin for error can be. As new generations of students arrived at UCLA, Andrea's name was no longer widely known. But among faculty, administrators, and longtime residents, the memory remained. It existed as a quiet awareness, a reminder of why vigilance matters, especially in spaces that feel safe. Andrea's parents continued to live with unanswered questions. They accepted that some details would never be known. What mattered most to them was that the truth had been uncovered, that the person responsible had been held accountable, and that Andrea's story might save others. They often spoke about Andrea's last evening, laughing with friends, working late into the night, talking about the future. They chose to remember her in that moment, full of life and promise, rather than in the horror that followed. In that choice, they found a measure of peace. In the end, Andrea Delvesco's story is not just a record of a crime and its consequences. It is a reflection of how quickly ordinary life can fracture, and how the effects of a single violent act ripple outward in ways that last far beyond headlines and verdicts. Andrea was 21 years old. She was a student, a daughter, a friend, a sorority sister, and a young woman standing at the edge of her future. Those who knew her remember her curiosity about the world, her generosity with her time, and her quiet determination to build a meaningful life. These are the details her family holds closest, the ones that matter most. The night she was killed has been examined from every angle, timelines dissected, evidence cataloged, decisions scrutinized. Yet even with all that analysis, the core truth remains painfully simple. Andrea should have been safe in her own home. Her case forces uncomfortable questions about responsibility, response, and the limits of certainty. It shows how procedures meant to protect can sometimes fall short when reality does not fit neatly into policy. It highlights the weight of judgment calls made in moments of ambiguity and the lasting impact those moments can have. For law enforcement, Andrea's case became a lesson in caution and awareness. For universities, it was a wake-up call about the vulnerabilities that exist beyond campus borders. For students and families, it was a reminder that safety is not guaranteed, even in places that feel familiar. But Andrea's story is also about resilience. Her family chose to transform grief into purpose, using their pain to advocate for awareness and change. Her friends carried her memory forward, allowing it to shape how they live, how they care for others, and how they respond to signs of danger. In these ways, Andrea's life continues to matter. True crime stories often focus on perpetrators, on the mechanics of violence, and on the mystery of motive. Andrea's story resists that framing. The facts are known. The person responsible has been held accountable. What remains is not a puzzle to solve, but a life to remember. Andrea Delvesco is not defined by the way she died. She is defined by the love she inspired, the impact she had, and the lessons her story continues to teach. Her case reminds us that awareness matters, that listening matters, that acting, even when certainty is elusive, can make the difference between tragedy and survival. And above all, it reminds us that behind every case file is a human being whose life was irreplaceable. Andrea's voice was silenced, but her story endures, not as a cautionary tale alone, but as a call to empathy, vigilance, and responsibility, one that continues to echo long after the courtroom lights have dimmed. Thank you for watching Forensic True Cases. If you found this case compelling, remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more long-form true crime documentaries that uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it lies beneath the surface.